Thank you. Thank you for all coming. I see a lot of old friends out there tonight. I haven't seen in a long time. The intelligence cycle is the process of acquiring information, taking that information, developing it into a product, and then delivering that product to the consumer. The consumers in intelligence are the actual people who actually start the cycle. They are the White House, governmental agencies, National Security Agency, or the National Security Council. Once the task is brought forth, and for argument's sake, or for our conference, we'll use as the lead agency the CIA. Once the task is given, or the need for that information is brought forth and delivered to CIA, it then goes through the first process of the cycle, which is the management of that. A team is formed. It's assigned to the division that is best equipped to acquire the information, and it goes to collection. The second part of the cycle is the collection. That's the gathering of the raw data. Those are done by overt and covert sources. Overt being open sources, radio, television, or our embassy staff that's overseas that will feed information to us. It also is brought forth or given to us by technical sources such as satellites, eavesdropping, so forth and so on. The last part of that is the clandestine services job. Those are the secret sources. We have the case officers that work on the street with the agents that they recruit and defectors. So to give us a good insight into the collection of the intelligence, and part of the intelligence cycle is Bob Baer. Bob served as a case officer in capacity in most of the world's hotspots. He served in Beirut in 1983 while our Marine barracks were bombed and our embassy were bombed. He then left there and served on the borders of Afghanistan and watched bin Laden put together his band that was later to attack the United States. In the middle of the 90s, Bob led a CIA team into northern Iraq in support of an attempted coup against Saddam Hussein. Later, he was in Sarajevo during the Civil War and helped to stop some of the fundamentalist groups in there for using that as a platform to further terrorism throughout Europe. Bob, would you like to pick up here?
Sure.
By the way, you know what? I do want to say one other thing before Bob speaks. Bob is also an author of two wonderful books. The first one is See No Evil. And it's an expose on how Washington politics drastically compromised the CIA's effort to fight global terrorism. His second book, which is out now in all the bookstores and on Amazon.com, is Sleeping with the Devil, in which he demonstrates how our addiction to cheap oil and Saudi petrodollars caused us to turn a blind eye to the culture of bribery, human rights, and the financial support the fundamentalist Islamic groups have been directly linked to in international terrorism and acts of terror. Bob?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'd like to talk about Iraq, since it's on everybody's mind right now, and what the CIA was doing there in the 90s. In 1994, I came back from Tajikistan and asked for an assignment to go back overseas again, anything to get out of Washington. And they said, no, we need you to work on Iraq, and we're going to make you deputy chief of the Iraqi operations group, which was, among its many tasks, was to collect information on Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction, what Saddam was going to do, was Saddam going to invade Kuwait again? And I sat down on the desk, and the first thing a case officer in the DO does is take a look at the assets and what we had. Now, at one point, we were very good on Iraq. Had pretty good coverage, and for a variety of reasons, we lost assets in Baghdad and various parts of Iraq overseas. So by the time I got on the desk in 1994, we had nothing. What we had was the Iraqi opposition, and I think anybody who follows the news these days, they're in power, and I use that word very loosely, in Baghdad. But I can tell you the information that they provided the Iraqi opposition was just, it was awful. I mean, it was you know, in intelligence in the DO, we want to disseminate information. We want to justify our salaries. We want to send this stuff in. You know, is Saddam going to invade Saudi Arabia and so forth, or do we have somebody near him? And I think the policymakers can pick up an intelligence report and look and tell whether it's any good or not. I mean, you know, after a while, I started to figure out what's good intelligence and what's bad, just by looking at the detail, the plausibility. Well, I can tell you in '94, we didn't know anything. We didn't know where the weapons of mass destruction were. We didn't know what the Army was going to do. Saddam had, you know, super encrypted his communications. We were fairly blind on Iraq. At that point, the Senate was starting to take interest, the Senate Select Intelligence Committee was starting to take interest in Iraq, and they asked if they could go to northern Iraq. And I was chosen to go with Senator Glenn, special representative, and Bob Kerry, special representative. We went to Turkey, crossed the border, walked into northern Iraq, and spent the better part of a week with the Iraqi opposition. And I found the Hill to be very receptive to intelligence, to good information and the rest of it, and they agreed with me that the Iraqi opposition, which was in the northern Iraq and the Kurdish area, wasn't providing decent information. We spent this week with Ahmad Chalabi, the head of the Iraqi National Congress, and he said, listen, you give me half a chance and I can provide all the intelligence you want on Iraq. I can tell you where the weapons of mass destruction are. I can get you inside the military. I can bring military officers across to the north where you guys can meet them directly and you can judge for yourself and you can start building an asset base that you can improve your intelligence. These Senate staffers were very impressed. They came back and they went to the director. Said we have to open up a CIA base in the north. They agreed. The National Security Council agreed. At the time, Martin Indyk was there. He said, "This is great. Yeah, we're unsatisfied with what you're producing on Iraq now, and if there's a chance of doing better, fine, go do it." The funny part of the story is that, and I supported this. They said, "Well, if it's such a good idea, why don't you go up and head this base?" So I did in January. And what I found out, and I don't have a dog in this fight, but the Iraqi opposition had no sources. Period. I sat with Ahmad Chalabi. I said, you got to produce these people. This is why we're here. There's the Zab River, the Greater Zab River, separated us from the Iraqi lines, and I said, come on, there's no lines here. Bring your officers across. Tell us what's going on inside Iraq. Just anything. He and the Kurds eventually produced a retired colonel who knew nothing about Iraq. And it's a case officer's job to, let's see what, all right, I said, all right, fine, you can't bring anybody across right now, but who are these people you have inside Iraq? And he says, well, we've got some people in a tank company. And I said, fine, well, tell me what the frequencies these tanks transmit on, because the National Security Agency can tell, it's not a big secret, can tell the frequencies. They can read this. They may not be able to read the communications. Couldn't do that. Because of this attempted coup in 1995, which I can't tell you was real or not because we didn't really know what was going on inside. There was this, people said they were getting ready to get rid of Saddam. Very confused. Coordination in Washington, this thing went badly. In any case, it became very clear to the CIA that the Iraqi opposition could not provide substantive intelligence of any sort, anything that could be confirmed. You couldn't. They would put unit locations in a certain place. We couldn't check it with satellite photography. One reason or another, the relations between the CIA and the Iraqi opposition went south. They cut off any meetings with these people at all. It was a waste of time. As it turns out, if what we're hearing, that was a mistake, because once you cut loose Ahmad Chalabi, the Iraqi National Congress, is that whole opposition made its way into Washington and bypassed the intelligence community. And in the vacuum of intelligence that the CIA had on Iraq, as best I can understand it, is the people inside Washington picked up this stuff and recycled it, and it made its way to the policymakers. What are the disadvantages of this? You can't vet this stuff. The CIA, when case officers, when they're doing their job right, can vet intelligence. The National Security Agency, with satellite photography, with polygraphs, with collateral. People that don't work in the business, as you all know, don't really understand how much patience this takes to work with these people. And, you know, I think history's going to tell, but, you know, you look at Iraq now, and the two people, the Shia in the south, that were close to the U.S. government, Abdul-Majid Khoy and Hakim, who was fairly neutral in this, are both dead. We've got a whole Shia group in the south. We don't really know what their politics are. We have no connection with Sistani that will let us understand what's going on. Everybody in the Sunni triangle, the tribal groups, the Ba'ath Party people, never had a connection with them. We don't understand really who these people are. And then you got the question of the Kurds, which is so complicated that I don't think anybody will ever understand them. You know, the tribes and Kurdish socialism. I spent months up there with them. And, you know, I think that we really have to look at Iraq, if this goes badly, as an intelligence failure. And, you know, Washington blamed the CIA for being soft on Saddam. That simply wasn't true. What we couldn't get across to the policymakers was just how hard it was to collect on a country that's a denied area. When you can't put people on the ground, if the closest you can get to Saddam is the Kurdish north, that's not close enough. Not having eyes on the target, not being able to confirm information, you're simply left with very fragmentary information, which is always the most dangerous situation you can in a country like Iraq. And I've written 2 books, and they both relate to the CIA. And what I can say in the defense of the CIA, and I could not write this story, frankly, is when it does well, it does very well. I have seen stuff on Russia that, you know, explains exactly what's going on there, but Russia's not a denied area. Iraq was, Iran is still, and you're always, you know, by not having human intelligence to supplement National Security Agency and DIA and satellite, you're always going to have a huge gap in your understanding. And that's basically
Go ahead. All right.
I hope that introduction
Well,
to where we
we'll
come
that.
from as case officers, and we know when we're doing well and when we're not.
You bet. So now we're getting the information in. The CIA now had the charge to go out there and gather the information that they needed on the ground. Bob went out there and collected the information along with our satellites and along with other information that was coming out of Iraq, but he explained to you how difficult it is to collect information in denied areas. Well, that information now comes back to Langley headquarters, along with all the overt information from newspapers and magazines and telecasts, videotapes or whatever, satellite transmissions, and they wind up now on a desk where somebody's got to separate all this information and decide what is relevant and what isn't. Now, that itself is not an easy task because there's more information that comes in than people we have to analyze it. But they try to separate the information that's going to go right to the next person I'm going to introduce. But before that, they have to separate the information that I don't think is relevant, but that information is kept. It's kept in a computer bank, and if any time in the future it's needed, it's there to bring up. So now we get to the production stage. This information now is assembled, and it goes to a national intelligence officer who takes a look, and his job is to develop that product. Now, the product may be just a briefing, it could be a report, or it could be the highest level of report that the CIA puts out, the National Intelligence Estimate. Our next speaker, Fred Hutchinson, was just that man. That was his job while he was with the agency. But prior to that, before I came to the agency, he was an infantry officer in Vietnam. And during his tenure at CIA, he completed 2 assignments in the Middle East and served as a U.S. Embassy political officer. He served at CIA headquarters in a number of executive positions dealing with intelligence analysis, covert action, counterintelligence, and special projects for several directors of Central Intelligence. For this panel, he will draw on his experience as both Vice Chairman and Chairman of the National Intelligence Council, where the principal intelligence product is the National Intelligence Estimate. Fred?
Thank you, Don. One thing an analyst has to deal with is his or her own bias. Everyone brings a bias, a viewpoint, a mindset to their job of analysis, whether it's a business analyst in the mutual fund industry, whether it's in some other manufacturing or in the intelligence business. That bias can frequently be identified by where you stand is how you see it. Bob gave us an anecdotal tour of Iraq in one particular time frame. What has to happen in the management of requirements, that is, what is it that is needed in the way of information to inform policy making, tasking those requirements to collectors, such as Bob Baer out on the border of Iran, looking across the Zab River, or whether it's tasking those requirements to some technical collection. That is the management of the requirements which precedes the inflow of information. Now, let's back up a minute and consider, we've got a chicken and egg proposition. Let's consider how we form the basis for this analysis. You have to have an organization of analysts who are well versed in all of the areas that are relevant to the requirements that you have or anticipate receiving. That means that the analytical community must know Washington. They must know the policy interests, the policy proclivities of administrations. And I think, as you all know, no administration is without its divisions in their policy perspectives. So intelligence analysts have to have a good feel for that as they proceed through intelligence analysis. Now, what do they draw upon? Several times in the 40 years or so that I've been associated with this business, we've made surveys to determine what was the source of information that analysts used in producing their intelligence judgments, estimates, assessments, or other pieces of enlightenment. About 70% of it is totally open source. It depends upon what they learned in college, what they continue to update their information through the media. The media is certainly producing more words these days. One can argue about the quality, whether the quality is any better than it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, but there's more of it. Has to be sifted. Maybe 10 to 20% of the information that they need to make these estimates will come from, as alluded to before, open source reporting, the State Department, all of its officers on the streets, talking with foreign diplomats in foreign capitals, and from the technical collectors, from conferences with academics who are really some of our better analysts of foreign issues. When you get down to the clandestine collection that Bob referred to, the estimate is it runs something like the clandestine input, the clandestine content of these things runs something like as low as 3% to as high as 10%. Now frequently that's the swinger. That's the key element that you're looking for. So you are trying to steal the secrets, the decisions that people are already making in other countries that influence our national security, has an impact upon our national security interests. The only problem with all this process is it's not as simple as I could diagram it, or as many academics have diagrammed it in some wonderful books. Because about half the time what you steal is the fact of the existence of a mystery. It's not a secret what Gorbachev intended to do the next month. He didn't know. So there are limits on this information that you can collect. Those limits translate themselves right on through to intelligence. Now, a matter of truth in labeling. I have some biases. Bob, I think, with his anecdote, has illustrated perhaps a bias that he has. I'm not a lifetime intelligence analyst. I've been an infantry officer, airborne, ranger, served with foreign armies, helped foreign armies, served in Vietnam. I've worked in the Pentagon. I've worked in American embassies. I've worked at CIA headquarters. My experience in the Directorate of Intelligence at CIA is limited to about 2 years. I was the manager of various analytical efforts. I had 2 tours as Vice Chairman of the National Intelligence Council overseeing the preparation of estimates on all of those areas around the world. I had 1 tour as Chairman of that group. My other experiences, as Don mentioned, were in other types of activities. I'm conscious of the bias that I bring to both this recitation and the bias that I carried with me through each of those jobs. Every intelligence analyst has to understand that. So what does it boil down to for an intelligence analyst or an intelligence analytical organization to do? That's to transform information into judgments, estimates that will enlighten policymaking. The kind of policymaking that an ambassador, such as Dick Murphy, served as an ambassador, as he served as Assistant Secretary for Near East in the State Department, we do not go to him as intelligence producers with the conceit that we can tell him what's going to happen in his area. We can simply pose to him some estimates of probability that several different things may happen, and we can share with him the likely implications of those. One of my CIA colleagues once said that the best analogy for an intelligence analyst or an intelligence analytical organization is that of the scout in the football league with the coach. The scout goes out, looks over the opposition, identifies the strengths and weaknesses, assesses what is likely to come up in the next game, shares that with the coach, and stops way short of predicting the final score in the game. But the intelligence analyst or the intelligence analytical organization should seek to have a partnership with the policymaker. Now, having a partnership does not mean that you have to subscribe to every bias that he or his organization or his administration brings to the problem. But you should have a partnership to the extent that you know what those biases are, you know what the pressures on him are, and you know what the likelihood of their policy selections will be. If in your best judgment they're headed to hell in a handbasket, it's not your position to tell them that too bluntly unless you are a good friend. And then you can say, Dick, you're headed down the wrong road. But you might want to suggest that that is an attractive road of policy that he's pursuing. But if it fails, here, sir, are some likely outcomes, and here's some alternatives that you could choose from today, or you could choose from if you see failure looming closer. We see the responsibilities of the intelligence analyst as being tucked tightly in under the arm of that policymaker and serving to enlighten his decisions all the way. I will mention in closing that there is a CIA website, www.cia.gov, and on there are a lot of interesting things pertaining to collection, analysis, and policy making, the relationship of the intelligence analyst to the policymaker. And I pulled off some that I'm going to leave with the president of this chapter as examples that he might encourage his people to tap into. But one that I pulled off, I want to touch upon a few of the highlights. During World War II, in the Office of Strategic Services, there was an organization within it called the RNA branch, the Research and Analysis branch. There was a Yale professor by the name of Sherman Kent in that, and he became so fascinated with the work of the intelligence analyst, how they served national security interest and policy making, that he wrote a book in 1949, maybe 50, Strategic Intelligence and Something or Another. It's still available. I recall reading it in the early 50s when I was in college and having at the time no thought that I'd ever get into the intelligence business. The book still reads well. But a few things that one can draw out of that book, plus some later writings of Sherman Kent, who then, after War II, served another 25 years in CIA before he retired and died in mid-70s. He said there's a doctrine for analysts. I won't go through the whole thing. First of all, focus on the policymaker's concerns. If they're concerned about a war in Iraq, don't concentrate on the agricultural economy of the Kurds. That may be a part of what you want to contribute in your analysis to the policymaker, but know what his concern is before you embark upon your work. Avoid your personal policy agenda. Now recall, I said a moment ago, we all bring a bias to everything we do. Know what yours are and avoid inserting it into your intelligence analysis, as the case officer must avoid inserting it into his reporting. Tackle your analytical work with intellectual rigor. Make a conscious effort to avoid analytical biases. That is, what's most obvious is not necessarily the conclusion. Willingness to consider other people's judgments. Test your work. Test your logic. Test those work steps that you used in your mind as you weighed the evidence, discarded evidence, looked at the alternatives. Talk to your colleagues. Make systematic use of outside experts. In my several excursions in the business of producing national intelligence estimates, I raided the college campuses all the time. Every time an estimate came up, you had sufficient time. I sent the scouts out and started bringing in the area experts. Remember, there's a collective responsibility for judgment. Intelligence estimates, intelligence judgments are corporate. Plenty of room for dissent. People can take footnotes all over the place if they wish. But remember, there's hardly anyone among us in the intelligence analytic community or even the policy community who know it all and are right all the time. We need effective communication of policy support, information, and judgments. If we are not in a dialogue with the policymakers, we will go astray with whatever it is we're trying to collect or whatever it is we're trying to analyze. Candid admission of mistakes. We make them all the time, and if we don't admit them, we will not learn from them, and our customers, the policymakers, will not learn. The challenge of the new information age, there's so much of that information out there. How do we use it effectively, efficiently, and how do we put it all together? That's 70% of what's available to everyone, that 20% in the somewhat closed community of state, CIA, other national security organizations, and the academic community, and that 5 to 10% that comes out of the clandestine. There's a real challenge on how to put all that stuff together. It takes you back to intellectual rigor. With that, I turn to my esteemed colleague, Ambassador Murphy.
Well, let me just give my 2 cents here. As we're moving along now, we're seeing how we've gotten the product, we collected the information, we delivered it now in a form to the policymaker. So it's going to come back now to the guy who started the whole thing, who put out the request to begin with, the policymaker. In this case, Ambassador Murphy from the State Department. Richard Murphy, after graduating from Harvard and Cambridge University and doing a stint in the Army, he joined the Foreign Service and State Department, where he served in Rhodesia, which is now, that was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. So all the people here are well versed on the Middle East. Returning stateside, he became country director for the Arabian Peninsula, then off again he became the ambassador to Syria, and then served as ambassador to the Philippines and Saudi Arabia. He returned once again to the U.S. and served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian affairs, and he was particularly active in the Israeli-Arab peace process. Ambassador Murphy?
Well, thank you very much. Policymaker. Well, let me start with putting me on the ladder of policymakers. I was on the lowest rung. Assistant Secretary of State is a great title, but you realize when you're in that position how many layers there are up above you. And there were occasions, no secret, when I was taken by surprise in areas and problems which I thought I was in charge of, when the President saw fit to move in a way I hadn't expected, and it was a done deed by the time I got to the office in the morning. So I come to you with that sense of humility about being a policy maker. The word estimate is used. It's not a monopoly of the CIA. We're all into estimates. And the best among us start with a healthy admission of our ignorance. I worked with some of our agency officers in Baghdad during that brief window when they were on the ground with our embassy functioning between 83 and 90. 7 years was all they had, all any of us had. There was a small intersection before 83, but the Iraqis had cut relations in 67 and didn't restore them fully till 84. the longest dry period and not being present that we experienced with any Arab country. And when they were there, I know from talking with the officers that served in Baghdad, it was denial with a vengeance. Saddam Hussein's regime was very effective at terrorizing his own people to keep their distance from any and all foreigners. They were all spies. So don't try to pick out the CIA agent or the political officer. Just stay away from them all. So when we went into Iraq this year, we went in with an unusually large degree of ignorance of the country, the society, the tribal relations, all the things you would like to be able to advise the White House on. But there was very, very little hands-on experience to build on. There were some good histories of before the Ba'ath Party took over. There were certainly good relations with friendly countries friendly to us who had stayed in Iraq after the cut in relations. But it didn't add up to that much, be it in the hands of the CIA, State, DIA, the others. I come to you from a morning session, which was for me rather rare these days, but I was invited down to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to talk about Syria this morning with a panel of non-officials after the current Assistant Secretary had testified. And at one point, Senator Biden, at his irrepressible best, said, "I think you're all smoking. You're smoking something." Well, speaking for the group, as soon as we got a word in edgeways, I said, "Senator, we do respect that these are federal premises, and I assure you we're not smoking anything." That was the only lift in the 2-hour period we had. Most of my career was out of the country. Most of my career was in our consulates, our embassies. In my first tour in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, there was no intelligence representation. It was a very small consulate. Second tour, I was in Beirut Language School. Third, I was in northern Syria with an intelligence representative from the agency, non-declared. In Syria, it was one of the countries which we were all assumed to be spies, so it didn't matter whether you were declared or not. You were all suspect. Then we had a relationship when I went on to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, where the station was identified. I don't know if all were identified, but those governments quite enjoyed having two channels to talk to Washington and to try to divine if there was any difference within the Washington hierarchy. You suggested there was occasionally some differences, didn't you? Occasionally, yes. Yeah. Well, yes. Not on my watch, as I recall it, but I have a fairly faulty memory. But they played it. They liked to play that they would try sending a message in one channel instead of in the other channel and play one against the other, see if it came up on the proverbial slot machine, all oranges. I got familiar slowly with the agency's system, the coding, the rating of its sources, the assignment of reliability ratings that they gave to their contacts. The veil was then, as today, still drawn by them over their sources, their methods, and we accepted that. They were honor bound to tell us when we were seeing the same people, which could be embarrassing if we didn't know it, and we risked double confirming to Washington a particular story, but it was the same source. I think that worked out pretty well, keeping the line straight. But I do recall, and perhaps this was the bias of an older generation, older than my own, at that first post in Syria, my colleague from the agency came up with a few reports which didn't fit with what I was hearing in my own work. And so when I went to Damascus and talked to our ambassador, who was a very distinguished man with a number of senior posts behind him, I said, well, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to evaluate this? I see it this way, he sees it that way. And as I say, maybe it's an element of bias of an earlier time, but his answer was pretty curt. Don't dismiss any of the information. But personally, I have found that information you pay for is not worth as much as information you do not pay for. That was his view. We can discuss that. So much depends on the question of trust between the individuals, which I certainly found working in the corners of the Arab world where I served, in the Philippines somewhat later. If there wasn't the trust, and that's something that every individual has to work out, then it became very difficult to trust the reports if you didn't have confidence in the individual, the chief of station, or the representative of defense intelligence. That partnership, and the word is the right one, that partnership in Washington was, which I carried back from the field when I had my most extended tour as Assistant Secretary. That partnership was carried out with my counterpart from the agency, head of the Middle East Division, in a weekly meeting where we would pretty well review the waterfront of what was in those days a very large area from Morocco to Bangladesh. There were issues that were none of my business, which was, in retrospect, in hindsight, unfortunate, but one of those was the Afghanistan war. That was a war that the agency was some individuals at least, were very proud of as being their war. And the liaison was at a more senior level than my own in the department and with the National Security Council. For a period after the end of that war, when the Soviets did pull out in '89, I understand that some of the public briefings done at the agency ended with the introduction of an officer saying, "This is the man who won the war." Well, that sort of hubris and the decision, which was not an agency decision, a decision of the White House and the Secretary of State to leave Afghanistan, to pull out, to close the embassy, to walk away from a fire which we had helped to start and perhaps was assumed would go out after we left, is the fire that burnt us 10 years later on 9/11. So I didn't have that much knowledge of what we were doing in Afghanistan. By and large, the echelon, my echelon and those below me in the Bureau had very little knowledge. But that was the way, the President was comfortable with it, and that was the overriding directive. And there was the influence, of course, of personalities, very strong personality, that of Mr. Casey as head of the CIA. When he was in Saudi Arabia and I was ambassador, when he visited Saudi Arabia, he wanted a private meeting with the king, and he got a private meeting with the king. Not strictly according to the rules, but that was his way of doing business, and I respected it. He had a charmed life with Congress. I went up to the first hearing on Iran-Contra, and I think it was deliberate. We'll never know, but perhaps you worked more closely with him, that the senators were very curious about how this mess had gotten started and what had been the roles of the agency, the government, the White House, etc. And they asked him some pretty pointed questions, not once, but twice and 3 times. Well, he had a technique of presenting sensitive answers at a sensitive time, which was, well, to the non-sympathetic, you would say, amounted to mumbling. And after the 3rd round of questioning, the senator said, well, all right, I understand, which he obviously didn't. And that hearing finally ended. The scandal went on and developed further. But we did have, as I say, we've talked mostly about the agency, certainly in Washington then, and I'm talking 83, 89, there was the beginning of a greater role played by the FBI overseas, not as developed as it became with the anti-terrorism law and the investigations in Yemen, the bombings of the embassies in Africa, etc. But I personally found, and I think this was not just my own reaction, the FBI was a much, much more opaque organization to deal with, and I think it was because they so totally distrusted the ability of State Department people to keep their mouths shut. We always thought the biggest leakers in town were in the Pentagon, but for some reason the FBI was convinced that all the damage was being done by state. I think that the reforms demanded by 9/11 and the work of the commission that is ongoing, knocking heads together throughout the intelligence community, is going to produce a better result for our government, for our country overall. There was a little too much competition in that sense and monopoly of wisdom and insights and sources, etc. So I think we'll be in better shape when the dust has settled on that tragedy. Please.
Well, thank you all. I do have a question I'd like to ask Bob. It's a little off the subject of Iraq, which I really would like to stay on, but it's close enough. What would, Mr. Ambassador, you too, you were the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. What do you think the prognosis is of Saudi Arabia in terms of their involvement in terror, and how that will affect the stability in the area vis-a-vis the economic stability of Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, and the United States?
You want me to start with that?
Yeah.
I just wrote a book on Saudi Arabia, which I did not attempt to pass myself off as an expert. And it was more of a question of what was happening inside Saudi Arabia. And before I left the CIA, I was curious about the divisions in the Saudi royal family and how it affected the stability of that country. And I knew that Ambassador Murphy had gone there and seen some senior princes, and he was certainly concerned about that at the time. And this was the it was 1995, I believe it was. And so I said, well, before I leave the CIA, I resigned in December 1997. I'd like to take a look and just see how much we know. But what's happening in this country was always a mystery to me. It was another black hole like Iraq was. And the CIA in 1986 started to combine all of its databases in a computer that belonged to the Directorate of Intelligence. And it took National Security Agency information, FBIS, DO reporting. And there was almost nothing there. We weren't inside the mosques. We were not reading the curriculum that was being taught in the schools. We barely knew who the clerics were. I'm speaking for the CIA. There may be academic experts that have a better handle on this. But more than that, we didn't, you in the Middle East, you cannot help but hear about the divisions in the royal family. You've got Lebanese and Syrians working for these people, and they talk about it, talk about competition, they talk about succession. And I got in there and looked at the DO stuff, and there just wasn't there. We weren't reporting on it. It was intentionally avoided. It was a country I think we didn't want to annoy at the time, and it got worse in the 80s and the so I got in there and I asked the question of how is it that this part of the world, the Gulf, which has 60% of the world's oil resources, we know so little about it. And this is what I wrote the book on. And I just came back from the Gulf this weekend. They're taking my first book and making it into a movie. And I went to the other Gulf princes to ask their opinion of what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Is it as bad? Are they going to be able to reform? Are they taking care of terrorism? The Saudis have now admitted that they have a problem after the May 12th explosion. As a couple CIA people explained to me, that there's fundamentalists embedded in the government. They're in the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense. Give the royal family a chance to get rid of them, and they're going to turn that place around. Keep the price of oil above $25 a barrel. They can, you know, reform the economic system, and they'll get out of this. It's a crucial question for us because what comes afterwards in Saudi Arabia? And I have no idea. Certainly opposition is not encouraging. It's very close to bin Laden. Mohammed Masari, Faki, the other people in London are very anti-American. They're very radical. And there was a consensus that things are not going well in Saudi Arabia. A couple Gulf officials said they give it 5 years unless the Saudis can change. They said that if I ever were given the chance to offer advice, is keep the pressure on them. They need to change. They need to correct the system. But if they don't, if the corruption is not limited there, if the curriculum in the school is not changed, it's going to go for the worse, and the royal family's going to collapse. So I guess, you know, we're Crown Prince Abdullah said that they're in the middle of a decisive battle, which the interpretation is we don't know the outcome. And I say at the same time, even though things are not particularly well in the kingdom, we cannot afford today to see the royal family collapse and have a popular revolution in Saudi Arabia, because I don't think anybody can tell us how long would it take us to get through that period. Is this going to be Iran 1979? And I think that's a good template.
Let me comment on a couple of things. That's one view. The part of it that I agree with is kind of some of the closing comments that Bob made. There's a long struggle ahead for the Saudi government, for the royal family, which is largely the government. There are major problems facing the Saudi economy, tremendous numbers of people underemployed or unemployed. There is concern, I think, in all quarters about how the impact of certain fundamentalists who are lodged in certain parts of the family or in the ruling administrative structure. So those were kind of the points that Bob was making as he was winding up there. Some of his earlier points I take exception to. He gave you the impression that I think that he believes that we had almost nothing on Iraq, almost nothing on Saudi Arabia. We still have almost nothing. I absolutely disagree. I absolutely disagree. I think maybe that's where you stand is what you see. Maybe he and I are standing on two different sides of the hill. I don't know. Maybe one of us is standing at a slightly higher elevation. We got a better view of it. But I simply disagree. We are not devoid of a significant amount of knowledge that enables us to make some very good assessments of what is going on there. nor are the policymakers even outside of whatever the intelligence people could contribute, are they bereft of knowledge or the basis for various estimates. All of us, however, share many of those concerns in the last few minutes of what Bob said. I think, too, we need to be careful with our language. There were a few phrases used, I think perhaps by Don as well as Bob, the Saudi government and terrorism. Well, and yeah, that's a concern. Any government and terrorism is a concern. But then be careful, else you lead people to believe that the Saudi government is consciously as a corporate entity supporting terrorism. I think you're making a grave mistake if you believe that or if you try to make people believe that. There are people within that family and within that administrative structure who are sympathetic to that. But watch your language, parse that carefully, and watch where you come out at the end.
Fred, I didn't mean to intimate that the government was directly or even indirectly involved in terrorism. It's just that they have turned a blind eye to areas where they know it's growing, and they have not handled the situation to anybody's satisfaction.
I would argue they haven't turned a blind eye, but they are very concerned about it. I think they have both eyes wide open. Now, maybe they're not doing as good a job as we think they should and could, but let's not forget that governments all have their weaknesses just like individuals do. Some of us can handle a particular job better than another one. Maybe this government right in this period is not handling it as well as the government 10 years ago or 2 years from now will. That's my only point. Just use your language carefully.
No, I'd like to add one thing, if you don't mind. When I talk about intelligence failures, the school I grew up in, the CIA, is when you're assigned to a station overseas, you are failing until you have a penetration of every organization, terrorist cell that could possibly do you harm. And that was the definition of failure. I've yet to see a station overseas that in fact met those standards, but not having someone inside those mosques where those 15 Saudis were recruited. There is a cleric out there who recruited those 15 Saudis. We don't know who that is until today. It's not been made public. And until we get that explanation, the intelligence community has failed. We had a Pearl Harbor on September 11th, and we need to explain why we didn't know. And can that be corrected? Maybe it can't be corrected. And that's what I talk about of the Directorate of Operation. I'm not talking about the Directorate of Intelligence. I'm talking about the Directorate of Operation. It's responsible for penetrating those cells. And when it fails the policy community and the American people. And that's my definition of, because I did counterterrorism for so long, and that's my concern.
Mr. Ambassador.
Well, I absolutely agree about we have to be very careful when talking about involvement in terror. People have taken, particularly in the popular media and the talk shows, the fact that 15 were Saudis on 9/11. And they race from there to the discussion of the government's involvement and have heavily suggested that there was, in fact, key members of that government, not just the family, but key members involved in a buy-off of Osama bin Laden. Do anything you want in Afghanistan, but just stay out of the kingdom. Well, that, all I can tell you tonight is an issue that I have asked and asked and asked about, and my understanding, there is not a scrap of evidence to substantiate that allegation that there was an attempt to bribe to keep them out of the country. The Saudis had all right, perhaps call it self-serving explanation of why so many of the hijacking team were Saudis. They said, well, don't you understand, we are the target, and our relationship with you in the United States is the target of Osama bin Laden. And putting that heavy number on the aircraft of one nationality, our nationality, was the effective way of driving a wedge between us. And if you extrapolate from that, well, it worked beautifully. The wedge has certainly been deep and painful between us. I think there probably is a much simpler explanation. The visa policy of our embassies, not just the embassy or the consulates in Saudi Arabia, but in dealing with Saudi Arab visa applicants. There probably was no nationality in the world that had an easier time to get a visa, because one of the basic questions any consular officer asks is, well, is this individual going to come back? Or is he going to find a way to slip into American society, get a job, get married, and disappear? And he's supposed to be the first line of defense in posing that question. Well, no consul ever had to worry about that because Saudis didn't stay abroad. It's not just they didn't stay in the States after 4, 6, 8 years in college, post-grad. They came home. Life was good. Life was easier. Life was very good for particularly the decade and a half in the 70s and 80s. So if you wanted to get a team together, the brains were probably the Egyptians, Atta, Zawahiri. The muscle, a very easy group to select from, were the Saudis, because they could easily get access to the States, no questions asked. Individuals who would have been refused automatically with any European or Asian, Latin American background, not a hope. They, in many cases, weren't married, didn't have jobs, but they had a high school education, and still, they wouldn't have qualified for an American visa if they hadn't been Saudis or Gulf Arabs. I'd include the Gulf as well. On the ability of the family, the broader question, what's ahead? And by the way, keep in mind the family is not your ordinary American-sized unitary family. It's up to about 7,000 males and uncounted because uncountable females. The family has stayed together on critical decisions and deferred to their senior leaders in a number of crises over the last 2 generations. And it's been about 2 generations now that their demise has been confidently predicted to happen within 5 years, 10 years, whoever you're talking to. What's going to happen to the market, I mean, the oil market, the source of 98% of their revenue, the source of the corruption of all oil economies where the money comes in without being produced by a labor force of the nation, but comes in thanks to foreign technology to the leaders, to the leadership, who then distribute it downwards. Well, they're going to remain among the oil producers of the world the cheapest producers. Caspian, Central Asian, Russian, aren't going to displace them in terms of cost. And the Asian market is going to be their prime market in the generation ahead. We may come up. I keep hearing we're coming up with hydrogen or some other wonderful solution. But I keep noting that our Congress consistently runs for cover when anybody suggests raising a tax on the gasoline. We've been paying, what is it, 1/3 of what a European consumer pays for a gallon of gas, even an imperial gallon. And, you know, the SUVs roll on. So our habits and the lack of political decisiveness to come to terms with this problem, to come to grips with it, doesn't inspire me to think that we're going to be not dependent ourselves. But even if we are not, even if we substitute more from Venezuela, Norway, Nigeria, Canada, the rest of the world is going to look at those very cheap producers in the Arab Gulf states, in Iraq, and Iran in the generation ahead. So can they change? Are they able to change? I would say they have shown signs. It's not conclusive. They're very slow. They're very anxious to move by consensus. Crown Prince Faisal told John F. Kennedy, 1962, that his concerns about a more participatory government were nothing he should worry about because we have a plan for a consultative assembly. They did. They announced the plan, and it came into effect 34 years later. Well, it was carefully studied, very carefully studied, but it came about, and then it was doubled in size. And now there's going to be an elected municipal council. Half of a municipal council will be elected, half appointed, the pattern that Oman has followed for the last decade under the Sultan. So there are signs of, yes, of flexibility and ability to open up. Will it be fast enough? Will events overwhelm them? We're back into estimates.
Would anybody like to ask any questions now? We'll open up for questions. Yes, ma'am. We'll start right with you.
The first question I have, excuse me, I'm in publishing, and I have to thank you very much for your mention about what you said in the webpage that you read. It reminds me of E.B. White's, Strunk & White's Elements of Style, very slim volume for publishing.
Used
that
it
is
in college.
it's marvelous, and that kind of reminded me of that. But the question that I really have speaks to what we're talking about this evening, human beings involved in this particular industry. And with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1989, and with China now reportedly involved in a great deal of trade with us and with others, and kind of masking perhaps what else may be going on in that country, with Milosevic behind bars and in prison and so forth, what is it about each of your positions, and this is about each of you, what is it about each of you at the time that you served, the qualifications that you had, you believe you had, that brought you to the attention that people that put you in those positions? And how do you think that may have changed? And what do you think the industry is looking for now for those same positions that you occupied then?
Oh, well, Fred, you want to take that?
Well, you start at the bottom of that pyramid of preparation with an interest in foreign affairs. You have to couple that with the appropriate education, which is both broad and excellent. You have to couple that with intellectual curiosity, or let's say curiosity anyway. And as you accumulate those facts, then you have to apply the intellect to it, assessment of your own capabilities, pick the organization you're going to enter. And I'm not sure that I've ever grasped just exactly all the issues that brought me to the attention of my superiors, or precisely why in my organizations, and God knows I've been in a lot of them over time, what brought that person to my attention and caused me to move him ahead of him. I know some of the qualities related to the particular job performance, but you ask a question that is cosmic, and I don't have any cosmic answers.
Bob, how about when you were recruited, what would be the difference now between the time in the 60s and 70s, what the agency was looking for, and maybe what they're looking for now? Maybe that.
Well, when I was recruited, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and I think the message back at the CIA at the time was, we had a simple question to answer: is when was the Soviet Union going to fire nukes at us? And it was much easier, I think, back then. If you could move toward that question, I'm talking about the Directorate of Operations, you were doing your job. I mean, when I came in, it was very clear that if you could recruit a Soviet military officer or whatever that could help you answer that question, you were a made man for your career. I think now with weapons of mass proliferation, these issues of terrorism and terrorist groups in Iran and narcotics, it's much more difficult, and you're going to have people who are much more versatile, and white Anglo-Saxons just aren't going to cut it anymore.
Dick, do you have any changes in the State Department?
State was always much more on-the-job training in comparison to, for instance, the military that could spend up to a third of their careers in various courses. When I came in 1955, the Eisenhower administration was looking around very uneasily at the graduates of our colleges and the incredible lack a total lack is not to exaggerate, of graduates with any proficiency in the hard languages of the world. And there was a recruitment effort. I mean, you had to volunteer for it in that it took up to 2 years of your career. You were out of the normal job rating system. You'd go to a language and area course. Chinese, Japanese, Arabic were the three longest. It was volunteer, and we were offered Nepali and Burmese, and I said to myself, not wishing to offend any Nepali or Burmese, that I didn't see pulling a shuttle career between Washington and their countries. And Arabic, Eisenhower had just taken a stand on Suez. Oil was an issue. The Arab-Israeli conflict might soon be solved, but probably would go on for a few more years. So I thought there might be an interesting career there, and I'd have a dozen embassies to serve at if I took it. So it was as mercenary a choice as that. But it was a response to a need which regrettably continues to this day. The military has trained, the intelligence world has trained in language and area. The State Department trains in Arabic, to my knowledge, something like 20 a year. They rarely, the officers rarely stay in the area. Or if they do, they don't keep working on their language skills. I think I got the job as assistant secretary because I had been in so much of the field, at least in the Arab world. I'd never served in South Asia. But it was, I think that was the reason that George Shultz asked me to come back to take the job. But that need is still right before us today. Our colleges are doing a very inadequate job, and the government still has to do the bulk of the training in a very intensive. I mean, our course was, for instance, 3 students to 1 teacher for a year, and 6 months 1-to-1, so of daily drills. And that's I've always felt, we need so much more.
On that particular point of training, I would comment that CIA, over its 50-year or so history, has vacillated greatly from no training to some training, no training, a lot of training, drop it again. And the last 10 years, they've formed the CIA University, which has, on the analytics side, I brought some of the stuff from the Sherman Kent School, which teaches the analysts. And then there's 2 schools on the clandestine side, the Richard Helms School and the George Kieswalter School. You can find a great deal of that information, by the way, on the website. And there's also some there's some unclassified, very interesting case histories of both operations and analysis and interactions with the policymakers on that website.
Yes, sir.
Is there anything that can be said about the seeming hostility of the Senate committee toward the agency right now?
Well, I don't know who to. Dick just came back from a hearing this morning, but it wasn't concerning the agency. But you testified a couple of weeks ago.
I detected the hostility when Porter Goss, head of the HIPSI, House Intelligence, asked me to testify in front of the committee. I knew there were problems between Goss and Tenet at that point. My understanding is that at this point, the CIA is managing very closely the information on 9/11. They do not want this stuff leaked out in the press, and I would imagine that they're withholding a lot from the committees because they don't want it to become political at this point while they fight this battle on counterterrorism. And Senator Shelby, who was chairman of this, had a personal animosity toward Tenet, which is based on a few incidents like this. And he thought that the CIA wasn't going after Saudi Arabia enough, and this is a personal interest his right now is tracing the charities and financing.
I'm sorry.
No,
just a little aside for you who may not know it, Porter Goss, who is the head of the committee, also was a case officer with CIA. So he's knowledgeable, should be knowledgeable of what's going on. Yes, sir.
Bill Tafoya, the University of New Haven, the New England chapter of AFL. Ambassador Murphy, earlier you commented about the FBI and the suspicion, you called it opaqueness of cooperation with the State Department. Using the investigation of the USS Cole as an illustration, could you comment about how you believe that the situation has changed with regard to cooperation in furthering investigation of that kind?
Are you informed, Bill, about the problem with Ambassador Bodine
Yes.
and O'Neill?
Yes.
Special Agent O'Neill? Okay.
I honestly, I don't know the details of the Yemen investigation. What I know from, secondhand, of the approach of the FBI to Yemen, because it was repeated in Saudi Arabia, was to send in a large number of agents, and under our laws to take over the investigation. Well, the ambassador had a government that she was dealing with that had the feeling that even if it's in a U.S. destroyer or barracks with American and other foreign nationals in Khobar, you've got to deal with the government as well. I mean, you can't just say because America has a law that says terrorism, when terrorism takes the life of an American, we take over. It doesn't work. And that tension was particularly high, I gather, between the embassy, the ambassador, and the FBI at that point in time. I haven't been in Yemen since that period. I have seen in Saudi Arabia that the FBI has worked much more smoothly, but they, at one point, I think I'm right in this, recalling a figure of something like 75 agents landed one day at Riyadh and said, "We're here to take over." Saudis politely said, "Go away." And just they sat in their hotels. They didn't get the access. They didn't get the interrogations, the interviews that they felt they had every right to and every need to have. So they've learned painfully. We've all learned that you've got to work with the other government. I think it's going better, is all I can say. It was very painful in Yemen. I know that.
Yes, sir, over there.
John Bucciarelli, I'm CEO WMD Task Force and retired Army. And from 1997 to 2001, I worked national security level domestic acts of terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction at the Department of Defense level. The question that I have for you is that we've talked a lot about the reformation of the Defense Department to deal with this asymmetrical war on terrorism and with lighter forces and things like that. And I'm willing to bet that the terrorists have better intelligence on us, both political, economic, social, legal, transportation, you name it. They've got better intelligence on our society than we do on them. So what do you see from an intelligence perspective on how we can deal with a threat that is non-nation state supported, that has a global capability, that kind of has infiltrated our non-traditional means of gaining information?
Fred, you want to do it?
I'd tackle that a bit. First of all, their intelligence on us takes you back to the Cold War. The United States is an open society. Soviet Union was a closed society. In essence, it was closed. It's a denied area. So we studied it from a distance, figuratively at arm's length. We could get very few people in there. Over time, the few people, academics, business, intelligence, foreign service, we began to build up knowledge about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, however, even at that time, was sending students here. We have a fairly well-known Soviet intelligence officer, former officer, Oleg Kulugin, who's now an American citizen, who went to graduate school at Columbia, just up the street. But there weren't many of those. Now let's look at today's terrorists. Take a look at the academic backgrounds of many of those at 9/11. I mean, you had a good skill. I'm not sure that any of the principals there had less than a bachelor's degree. Several of them had master's degree. Think about some of the recent, as the military calls them, high-value targets that they've snatched in Pakistan, Iraq, and whatever. You find people who spent 10, 15 years in this country acquiring an education and knowledge of our society. Does that put them ahead of us? In some ways, yes. In some of the tactical ways that Bob was talking about a moment ago, that gives them more, quote, tactical collectors on the ground. That gives them more analysts with intimate knowledge of this country, the society, how it's organized, what would impact greatly upon our national psyche. But having said all that, I am not as pessimistic as many in the press, and unless I've misread you, I'm not as pessimistic maybe as you were in looking at that asymmetrical intelligence picture. I think we're getting there.
Could I just add,
Yes, sir.
I think one essential these days is maximizing our cooperation with foreign intelligence agencies, agencies of countries that have historically been friendly with us and some that have been real adversaries, if not enemies of us. And the extremes I'm thinking of are Syria on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other. It helps that both of those were hit by, in a major way, by terrorist violence. Al-Qaeda struck last May in Riyadh. The Muslim Brotherhood struck in Syria in 79, 80, 81, till Assad reached the point of no return and blew up a third of the city of Hama. But both governments have been motivated to help, to work with us. Qaeda is the one exception for the Syrians in cooperation. They don't see the Palestinians as terrorists. They're national resistance fighters. They don't see the Lebanese Hezbollah as terrorists. We don't agree on what's the definition of terrorism, but they have information in Syria that we benefited from. And the Saudis have it, each in their own way can contribute something, and the more cooperation and the more mutual respect we develop between our intelligence agencies, the better.
You have to give a little to get a little, and you have to be sensitive about the nationalistic sensitivities, the national pride, the religious feelings of these people. Apropos the 75 FBI agents landing en masse in Yemen, what do you expect? You've got to give a little. Maybe 2 agents, and you could have greased the skids and done that a little more deftly. But since then, some of the damage has been repaired. We can't expect 100% cooperation from any of them. We don't get it out of West European services.
Colonel Braverman?
Military intelligence background at the DIA and also with various types of technical collections. You mentioned the importance of intellectual honesty in analysis. And yet you also, and I think all of you talked about the biases that exist. It was also mentioned about the FBI not thinking that other agencies were up to the level of their type of thing. But it seems as if almost every agency in the intelligence community shares some of that, where what has been done within their agency is looked on with greater credibility than what comes from any other agency. And because of that, some of the final product suffers. And how do you see that being resolved, especially with the necessities that are now exist not only on a global scale, but certainly at home, too?
If I wanted to express this more elegantly, I'd take more time. But in order to be brief, I'll not be elegant. You have to hammer home the fact into every person who enters an intelligence service or the foreign service and that you have biases. You, my friend, have biases. I have them. Everyone around us does. Now we have to, it requires intellectual rigor to identify those, keep them right here in mind as you are working through these problems, and account for how that is influencing where you're coming out in these estimates. You also have to know that your policymaker, whom you are serving, has these biases. There you must take the time to be deft and elegant and identify to him or her what those are, and from where they are coming, they may see this a little differently, and encourage them to see it in several alternative ways. You cannot eliminate bias. You must recognize it and deal with it.
But also acknowledge that your bias is more than mine.
Of course.
So.
I think we have time for one more question. Way back there. Oh, no. Hold on a minute. Let her get the microphone over there, back there.
Howie Passman from Boston. I have a question and a comment. It's my understanding that both the French and the English have greater hard assets on the streets of the Middle East as opposed to what we have. And we've been relying on technology all these years, probably since the Church Amendment, to get that intelligence. Just your comment, how are we going to turn this curve around?
Did you hear the question?
I heard it.
Okay, go ahead.
I haven't been impressed by MI6 myself, but, you know, let me answer the question by Iraq today. I think it would be a nightmare to be assigned to Baghdad on that compound, trying to penetrate these groups that are using suicide bombers to blow us up. I mean, what's the incentive for these people for spying for us? I think intelligence is going to get harder to collect in a situation like the war in Iraq. I have no idea how you can solve this thing right now. I wouldn't want to be assigned to Baghdad. And you're right, we do need more people on the ground. But let's go back to the Arabic. The CIA trains a lot of people in Arabic. They've got a lot of good speakers. But who wants to be assigned for 20 years, you know, going from Yemen with children and getting sent to Baghdad separated from your family? Is what we have to do is find some way to get people to spend more time in the Middle East and be rewarded for it, and I don't know how you do that. Excuse me? You got to triple their salary. You know, people serving in these really hard places, it is really hard, and there's not much financial compensation or much reward because you're working in the dark. The more time you spend on these places on the ground, the easier it is to pick up sources, and you almost have to become an expatriate, just cut off from your society. It's really hard, and it's a crisis the intelligence community is going to face for a long time.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of you for coming, Ambassador Richard Murphy, Fred Hutchinson, and Bob Baer, and thank all of you.
Your group 55. Really? Yeah. Old men. Sure.